Hey everybody, how's it going? I just want to welcome you back to Media Ethics. And here we are again, and we are nearing the halfway point of the semester. I know I have the exam going on pretty late, but right now is all a matter of just really I like to think that this class is largely a lot of kind of like almost like a pass fail. It's kind of set up where basically participation is what matters. Um, but we do have the midterm exam guide that'll be coming up. Um, I'll be talking about that in 2 weeks, and then I will be talking about something else next week that'll deal with your extra credit opportunity, which will be interesting. That'll help bridge us from the book to the oral presentations in April. Um, and across the exam. So, March will largely be about the exam. Um, anyway, I appreciate the participation in the discussion points. How about we go to that? Remember, I am actually keeping track. Um, and I am just waiting for the there we go. Okay. Well, this is actually the teacher's view. So let's go to the one that was actually doing this over the weekend. So not everybody has filed yet. Should news organization pay for news sources? Loading replies. Hannah again coming in number one. Thank you, Hannah. News organizations should not pay for sources because it compromises truth and credibility. Well, that's an excellent point. Although paying for an interview makes it easier to produce a good story, it also opens up the opportunity for sources to tell reporters what they want. Well, it's exactly what I was talking about. But basically, they call it checkbook journalism, where you basically just say whatever you want and it goes out, and then basically some of these places just take it and run with it and don't really care about the consequences. So Alex basically writing about checkbook journalism, same deal. It could tarnish the publication's reputation. And then as I was talking about, I mean, it was interesting just to learn that 60 Minutes had actually paid for some interviews, which really I kind of found a little bit shocking. But maybe I shouldn't be. But you know, this is apparently how we roll these days. And I cited that John Edwards thing with the National Enquirer, you almost would expect, and that goes to the whole social contract issue. Almost would expect the National Enquirer to do this kind of thing because they do behave unethically, and you know, people who read it, I think like the thing you hear when people read these scandal rags is that they always say there's a nugget of truth to it, and then once in a while they come out with something that actually tells the truth. National Enquirer was actually cited as like probably the best resource during the 90s during the O.J. Simpson trial. So there is that. And they were right about John Edwards. So the former vice presidential candidate, former senator. So anyway, so I appreciate the participation in that again, and we will continue doing these discussion points probably right up until about spring break. I won't ask you to do one over spring break, and that is very likely when we will stop. Okay, so what do I have new for you? Again, I haven't actually posted this yet. It'll be available on Monday. This is the new discussion point. This due on March 6th. Can the government ever be trusted with telling the truth? And I mean, that's actually kind of really more of opinion than anything, but it really kind of relates to what we're going to be talking about today. The last of the chapters of the book, chapters 8 and 9. But this question kind of turns it on the head a little bit because I'm going to talk about the importance of the media in terms of being a government watchdog. But at the same time, also the importance, or is it important? Is it a good idea to actually use sources from the government, or just trust to use them and rely on them as your single source? So let's go to my Kindle here, and I actually meant to go to beginning of chapter 8. So this is the end of the book, guys. So, like I said, we will be reviewing. Boy, it's going really slow. Not sure why. All right, so let's just go. I'm just gonna have to do this manually. I'm sorry, I meant to set this up ahead of time. Okay, so this first one deals with the government watch. And there's so many examples out there about with news publications in particular are really not doing their job, really kind of falling on their asses when it comes to actually like doing their jobs and really holding the government's feet to the fire, especially because the government is really like your number one target for journalists. I mean, that's why they call it the fourth estate, because it is supposed to not serve as a branch of government. It is supposed to actually serve as, a watchdog. The one thing out there is actually supposed to protect the public against government overreach. And the book like cites certain examples, obviously, but what I like to point to, and again, whenever I like highlight something, it's actually could appear on the exam, but basically, I highlighted this part about the main role that the media serve as a government watchdog and why. Right here on this page, right here under this section, it says government secrecy, because government does secret things. And they're allowed to do it, and they're even allowed by law to allow to keep things secret. So, but anyway, they're not actually allowed by law to keep everything secret, or even most things secret, because they are publicly funded and they're basically supposed to be our employees, not the other way around. So anyway, journalists report about most areas of American life, including business, sports, and entertainment, but it's the city, county, state, and national governments that have traditionally gotten the most intense and vigorous surveillance. Three key reasons for this are: government controls many aspects of life. It can take away freedoms, imprison people, regulate businesses, impose taxes and tariffs, and even send citizens to die on the battlefield. So we've seen this in war, and then this chapter actually brings up Vietnam being probably one of the, not just the Watergate scandal that brought down President Nixon in the early 70s, but Vietnam War being really the real classic example of something that where the media really kind of for the first time really stepped in and saw government overreach. I mean, they did before, but not on such a grand scale, and really helped bring an end to that war. Unfortunately, not the way we wanted to. 50,000 people died on the way there, which is unfortunate, including my father-in-law. My wife's father died in the war in 1967, a month before my wife was born. So, anyway, it was unfortunate that it took a very long time for it to get there. But imagine if the media hadn't been there, maybe 100,000, maybe 500,000 would have died. Who knows? Maybe it would have rivaled World War II. Maybe it would have continued into the 1980s. Who knows? Imagine that. Government runs on tax dollars. When the government wastes money, it is wasting money collected from citizens. When it adopts new programs, those programs are paid for with money it takes from citizens and taxes. So, I remember how many times we've done stories about salaries of certain public employees. It's interesting, like when you watch maybe TV shows like The Sopranos or something like that, and you talk about things like, I mean, you just know this from general, knowledge of the mob doings, but one of the big things they do in government, like they do in the mob, is they like to have their no-show jobs, where basically they hire their people, that help them out however way possible, and they give them a job, and basically it's a no-show job. It's basically a job that doesn't require anything, just a title, and it's kind of supposed to be viewed as a reward. Maybe you do some work, maybe not. Usually it's like hidden under the name of a consultant or something like that. And those of you who watch Sopranos, it's interesting to watch the class. That's even more of a classic example there, because there were scenes where they showed guys who were, they had construction jobs essentially, and they gave these people in the mob these no-show jobs, and all they did there was sit on their asses and like drink beer while everybody else was doing the construction work. These were no-show jobs. And similar in government too, because they, again, like they may give somebody like an aide job, a consultant job, that sort of thing, and all they do is maybe just talk to people. Maybe all they do is just hang out with that person. Maybe they just sit on their ass and do nothing and just go on Zoom. So, when you see these kind of like things pop up in euphemisms like the word consultant or something like that, that's like, and you come up with these salary lists that show that, that's like the reporter's job to basically kind of point out and say like, hey, what's that for? What's that for? So, in a democracy, citizens can make a difference. They can influence government by voting, attending public hearings, and voicing their opinions. But first, the media must alert them to what's going on. So, yeah, I mean, the media has to basically, I mean, there are a few cases where the media, and I might have talked about this before, Media is actually allowed under what's called the Open Public Records Act, which was passed after Watergate. And that is basically everything except for the media. The media cannot have access to, or is not, doesn't, I shouldn't say that. The government is allowed to keep secret certain things, one of them being national security issues, things that might threaten our lives internationally or whatever, or threaten our national security, like A-bombs or something like that. Another thing would be public safety, and that's similar to national security, like police matters under investigation, that sort of thing. Court matters under investigation, that sort of thing, might influence the investigation. Another one is actually lawsuits are also litigation information when it's not the lawsuits themselves, but the litigation when they're actually the lawyers are discussing things. It's almost like a doctor and their patient or attorney-client privilege. That is not supposed to be influenced by outside influences, so that is actually allowed to be kept under wraps. Also, public or employee information is actually allowed because it could affect personal, private information about somebody that could be slanderous or whatever. That's allowed to be kept secret. So, but everything else, sometimes you have to jump through hoops with public records. It says here. Sometimes you have to fill out what they call an Oprah form. That's essentially in New Jersey. It's Open Public Records Act, and they actually kind of find a way to like kind of skirt around these things a lot. Yeah, it's called Oprah. Here's in the Jersey government, state government one, and they're allowed like certain. It's funny because when this was actually passed like 20 years ago, I actually thought like it actually did a lot to actually kind of prevent people. It did a lot of good because it basically forced people who weren't saying anything to release information. But at the same time, what it did was they were supposed to release information. What it did was it actually supposedly was supposed to spur them to do it in a more timely manner. But what it did was it set rules that actually made it some people go slower because the time span, I think, is like a week or two or something like that to actually just respond. In the old days before this was passed, if you had like a cooperative agency or something like that, they would just basically give you the information, say, here, just get it out of the way. Now they take full advantage of this. So there's good and bad in that. And this is basically like, set up in a way, look at this, it looks like it was written like 20 years ago, this website. It's like not even the full page, and you basically have to fill out and like basically write the Constitution in order to get your information. So they do set like certain guidelines for doing that. Open meetings, basically like when you have a meeting, you're actually allowed to actually speak at the meeting. You're allowed to actually watch the meeting. A lot of the meeting, especially now, post-COVID, if you want to call it that, in COVID, a lot of those things are actually just held on Zoom now, or just people just watching on Zoom. Basically like they can get pretty interesting. You can see them on YouTube. Okay, I just call it up right here. Council meeting erupts into chaos.
As markets fall and markets rise with swings of joy and dread, consider how to optimize with betterment. We begin this hour 18 with chaos at City Council. It started over concerns related to Anjanette Young's wrongful raid case and ended with an abrupt adjournment and complaints the mayor isn't following the rules. CBS 2 political investigator Dana Kozlov lied outside City Hall saying
jump to the meeting
of mistreating people in our community. So this ain't about that. And so I second Alderman Lopez. I'm not changing it.
Normally, aldermen say council rules require the move to defer automatically delays the vote for a month, but Mayor Lori Lightfoot allowed comments and then a recess. Afterwards, still more fireworks over apparent procedural missteps.
According to our rules of order, according to our rules and regulations, there were several Rule 41s that were posted that have to be addressed at this
so
meeting.
I guess sort of involved a certain testimony involving a certain person who committed some wrongdoing, but you can see it's all out in the open. There's people there sitting there. There's people speaking. The public is allowed a chance to speak themselves. I mean, a lot of times you get basically kind of like shoved away when you actually try to make statements and that sort of thing. But you are allowed to make those kinds of statements Same applies to like Congress, same applies to like the Senate. People are allowed to visit and watch, okay? Yes, the government spins, that's what they do. And, you know, it's your job to basically kind of like take control of it back. And not allow the government to kind of like run away, but it's not just the government, because like one thing we've seen actually, and it talks about war and that sort of thing, and we talk about the Vietnam War, but one thing we've noticed is that, with certain things that are involving like even people running for office, you know, you don't get a lot of cooperation, and sometimes like reporters actually kind of fall into a trap where, you know, it says here holding stories, reporting untruths, where basically they might use a little bit too much of their own gut feeling, and this time the gut check isn't maybe the right thing to do. Maybe they should go through the Potter's box and answer all the questions, because maybe the ethical principles don't apply, but they rely too much on their own instincts to basically carry the day. And that's not necessarily a good thing, is that this is where maybe the Socratic method will apply. Maybe there's a certain case involving somebody who like lies about themselves, and they, you know, and it's the government's job it's the media's job to serve as a government watch to really do like a thorough vetting of somebody who's like running for office. And there's probably no better example in this case you might have heard of, and I think I brought up before, than this man, George Santos, who won congressional seat on Long Island. His background was pretty much just all fiction, or largely fiction. And what's amazing about this was like, I think this was the article actually that came out that basically like revealed everything. Now, interesting thing about this date right here, December 19th, 2022. If you were in class right now, I'd say, what's the significance about that? Let's think about that for a moment. If you think about it, well, I'll let you know. That is a month after the election. He was elected. Why is this story coming out a month after he was elected? This is a big example of a media fail, okay? Media fail, where they basically kind of ignored what the hell he was doing, what the hell he was saying, and just let it go. I mean, it's really the media's job to really like kind of find out who the hell is running our government, who the hell is like control of our taxes and everything else, okay? So he says here, George Santos' election to Congress on Long Island last month helped Republicans clinch a narrow victory in the House, built his candidacy on a notion that he was full embodiment of the American dream. His campaign biography amplified this storybook journey. He is the son of Brazilian immigrants, first openly gay Republican to win a House seat as a non-incumbent. By his account, he capitulated himself as a seasoned Wall Street financier and investor with a family-owned real estate portfolio of 13 properties. But a New York Times review of public documents and court filings from the United States and Brazil, as well as various attempts to verify complaints that Mr. Santos, 34, you can just give me like 1 second here. Oops. I have to pause for a second. Okay. Sometimes I just get bugged by work things, even though it's way, even though I'm off. All right. Anyway, so let's go back to this New York Times thing right here. Okay. Citigroup and Goldman Sachs, blah, 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 told the Times they had no record of him ever working there. Officials at Baruch College, which Mr. Santos was, he graduated from 2010, said he had no record of him matching his name, blah, blah, blah. So that went on and on and on. It's interesting is actually like my old organization, Patch, which covers like local news. I went back and looked at back, see if I could find many articles on them. And you know, it's funny because you have two problems when you have like a media fail, and that is that they don't report on it, or they just don't, or when they report on it, they don't mention it, or they get it wrong. And it's interesting because I was actually, before all this came out, I was looking at the story again. They were covering local news, so I tried to find like anything that basically like might have actually rebutted the claims he was making. And this is a story that announced that he was elected. Santos declared winner, and this, now look at the date, November 8th, right here. Okay. Voters went to the polls. Zimmerman led Santos. So they basically were saying that AP declared him the winner. And then, you know, as these stories normally do, because I used to work there, they go into a little bit of a background. George Santos, 34 of Queens, has a finance and investment background. He was also a Republican nominee in 2020. According to his official campaign biography, George is a seasoned Wall Street financier and investor. So that's it. That's it. Right there. That's all they had. That's a fail. Okay. That's why my writing for media classes, I always say to people, like, don't ever take the first answer as gospel. You got to dig deep. You got to get into people's, like, you got to get down on the ground level and really report the anecdotes about people's lives that matter. And right here, I mean, I know working at Patch and everything, this is kind of like symptomatic of, can't always blame the reporter, but you get like overworked. We used to have a situation there where we had like one person per each patch, what they call it. And there's a patch. It's a news site that covers each town on their map. Not every single town in the United States, but ones they've picked. And this one is actually on the Oyster Bay, New York patch. So anyway, so I know that, but then like they lost a lot of money when they had that one patch per person relationship. So they actually sold and they lost a lot of money, and then it became like each person has like 10 patches or 5 patches or 10 or whatever, 50, even 15. So there's a lot of work involved. So you don't get like a lot of time to do like a lot of investigating, but maybe a couple of extra questions. And apparently what happened was there was words circulating, and his opponent was like pounding on the wall, basically saying, there's stuff about him, you got to do stuff, blah, blah, blah. And there was this article by the the Nation. Anyway, they basically talked about how this was like a total failure. And they pointed to like one publication, a very little known publication, that actually did point out these questions or raise questions. It says here, responsibility for this farce does not end there. By some pre-pandemic counts, more than 1 in 10 reporters live in and around New York. Not all of them cover politics, of course, and not all of those who cover politics cover congressional races. But at least some of them do, and almost none of them apparently asked before the question, hey, what's up with this George Santos guy? They didn't seek out college roommates or old work colleagues. I mean, I know it sounds like you're really prying into somebody's privacy, but again, public tax dollars. These people are basically going for a job interview, okay? So we want to know about them. We want to know. I mean, we once, there was somebody actually, we were ready to hire a patch who actually had a background where they killed somebody or something like that. And they couldn't even tell me what it was about. But, you know, this came up in police records, so we didn't hire him. So now he wields a 100, whatever, legislative power he has. I say almost done because one local newspaper actually did sense that something didn't add up. North Shore Leader, which covers Santos District, Long Island, raised questions about his finances in September, but his inquiries received little attention. Okay. Actually, and let's click on this there and see what they came up with. Oh, the Washington Post wrote about it, about how they did it. I guess it's not, this paper is just a little attention that doesn't even come up online. North Shore Leader wrote in September, when a few others were covering Santos, about an inexplicable rise in reported net worth from essentially nothing in 2020 to as much as $11 million 2 years later. Holy crap. And there it is. There's a North Shore Leader. So yeah, I didn't even like really, I barely even scratched the surface about this guy, but anyway, so that's like your perfect example of a media fail. And there's so many reasons behind it, as I mentioned, that, you know, it's not just all the reporters' fault. There is lazy reporting out there. There's no question. There's lazy editing. Better guidance, as we talked about with Jason Blair, would have helped, but it didn't in this case. So chapter 9 kind of like goes into that, because kind of an extension of that, because it's just the shady world of unnamed sources, because sometimes the only resource you have to actually get to the truth, the most obtainable version of the truth, is to actually use those unnamed sources. And this chapter talks about like how basically there's like, and we've talked about this, about how, you know, it's not always like the right thing to do, because like you never know, people might be telling you what you want to hear. But for the government watchdog, and that's what I consider this chapter and why it's important, is basically it's probably no more important, because that's sometimes with the way the government is set up, there's so many rules that are put in place by the government leaders, that sort of thing, kind of like the mob, where they basically prevent people from talking to anybody. And that happens with corporations too, or anything else. But basically, and I mean, some of this you may have known just from your history books and everything, but it's very important to bring up the example of where it does work. And probably obviously the most important example would be the most celebrated use of an anonymous source. It says here was the Washington Post expose of the dirty tricks and cover-ups of the Nixon administration. Reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein described their investigation in a best-selling book, All the President's Men, which turned into a movie, and gave their source the memorable nickname Deep Throat. Almost overnight, the prestige of reporters soared. Students flocked to journalism schools. I mean, they became stars essentially. So in that particular example, it was a perfect example where basically it worked. And as I mentioned before, like going off the record, as they did what it's called the deep background, where they basically just printed information without a source because they knew it to be true. But if they printed it, said according to an unnamed source, that might actually, believe it or not, give some people like some sort of like hint who it was. Like only one person would know who that is. That's it. By basically not saying there was a source at all, basically kind of led people off the trail a little bit. So anyway, that's actually important to know right now, because actually I have this extra credit activity that's going to be related to that, which I'll talk about next week. So anyway, just keep that in mind. I actually purchased All the President's Men, and it's interesting because, again, if you don't know the story, again, it involves two reporters, Bob Woodward, who came up with the most obtainable version of the truth saying, and Carl Bernstein, two reporters of the Washington Post. I believe Woodward still works for the Washington Post, even though he's 80 years old or something like that. Bernstein's close to the same age. Anyway, so Bernstein's been doing other things since. Anyway, they wrote a book, the whole thing, but they were first kind of cast aside. They were not big time reporters at the paper at the time, and they were Woodward is actually one who kind of fell upon the story because he covered some sort of a break. You covered a break-in at Watergate as a police matter, a regular routine police matter, or as the Nixon administration called it, a third-rate burglary. And when he went there, he discovered that he went to the court hearing for this, which is what you do typically in a police matter or something. You might try to follow up, see what's said in court. And all the people basically who went there said they worked for the CIA. So right there, unlike what happened with George Santos, Bob Woodward didn't take his first answer as the story. He went deeper and further and found out there were layers to this story that we didn't even know about. Now, they initially ran into some struggle with that because they found themselves really kind of stretching to get answers, and they weren't getting a lot of stuff out of that. So they and Jason, I'm sorry. Anyway, this actor, I forgot his name. Sorry. He actually, Jason Robards, I'm sorry. He played the editor, Ben Bradley. He was a celebrated editor. Everybody loved him, the whole thing. And he's going to be the man who's going to be walking across the newsroom. You're going to see in a second. You can see how they come up with their first story, which is pretty lame on this matter, and how he reacted to it, and how it basically got them, how they felt like they were stuck, and basically why anonymous sources basically played an important role for them. Okay, so let's show this right now. This is Ben Bradley. Sorry, I didn't copy it. He's approaching. You can see Robert Redford. You might know him from the Marvel movies. I don't know. I'll show you in a second.
Solid piece of American Journal, the New York Times.
All right, so this is Robert Redford playing Bob Woodward, who was basically essentially a city reporter at the time. This is Carl Bernstein, who was essentially a city reporter at the time, right here. And this is Jason Robards. This is Dustin Hoffman, by the way, and Robert Redford. And this is Jason Robards playing the Oscar-winning role of Ben Bradley. And by the way, very 70s. You can see typewriters, stuff like that, no computers.
Get it. Librarian and secretary say, Hunt, look at the book. That's not good. White House.
The story was basically about how like one of the burglars was looking at a book that might be connected to like whatever the White House does. It was pretty lame what they came up with. It led to nothing and no connection to anything about the burglary and how the White House was involved right after President Nixon.
Now, say told me that Hunt was investigating Kennedy. Was it? Was it? Want the name you mean? No, how senior, how high up? I don't know, Tyler.
Basically, like the background was that basically the Nixon administration feared that Ted Kennedy, brother of President John F. Kennedy, was going to run for office, and maybe like him looking at a book, this one burglar looking at a book, suggested that they were breaking into the Watergate offices to find out secrets to see if Kennedy was going to be running in the 1972 election, which Nixon really feared because he lost to Ed Kennedy's brother in the 1960 election, presidential election. So it was a real stretch.
White House. Story stronger than that. We got a White House librarian to come check out a whole lot of folks. We got a secretary of Colson's office. All right, that's a problem. Man, that's a page one story. Stick it inside someplace. This is a goddamn important story. Harder information.
So, you know, they're going for those layers beyond what they know. And that's when it required like Bob Woodward to go that extra step, as you'll see when he went to the probably the most famous anonymous source in history, otherwise known as Deep Throat. He goes to a telephone booth to contact him.
I want to talk about Watergate. No, look at us top. Talked about Wallace. It's about the shooting of a man running for president. This is different. How? Not about this story, don't.
Well, then actually Deep Throat actually eventually did contact him, but in a very weird way. He told Woodward to basically he left a note in the New York Times, I think it was, paper that Woodward picked up from his back then it was nothing digital. Picked up at his apartment door, and he told Woodward to leave out a red flag and a flower pot or something like that whenever he wanted to talk to him. So you might know about this, but Watergate, by the way, was a hotel where the Democratic headquarters was located. So anyway, the meeting place, you might have heard about this, was a parking deck, which almost became a metaphor for basically people hiding in secret and telling secrets. And he had to basically follow all these different trails to get there. And let's just go to there, and then there's the meeting. And then they basically this is where like you do in sales, where Deep Throat gave them the most important lead they could ever have that helped them solve the whole mystery eventually. And you'll hear it right at the end of this conversation. And basically go to those layers that they needed to go beyond.
Thought I know. What you mean with this anonymous source? Trust me. Can you tell me what you know? You tell me what you.
Ugh, I'm sorry. Hold on. Press the wrong button. I apologize for this. Anyway, I was gonna say that Howard Hunt was one of the burglars, and he's talking about that.
What you mean by this anonymous?
Basically you talk to him largely off the record. So like I told you before, you talk to people off the record and you find out information, you try to get it on the record or anonymously.
Trust me.
We've seen this already. I'm sorry. Go on. Okay.
Can you tell me what you know? You tell me what you.
Okay. Don wouldn't know. Oh, so Colson, that's what I meant to do. Colson was somebody who worked with the president. So basically they're trying to establish the connection. Hunt, Colson. Colson was like a special aide to the president. There's that word again, right? Special aid. He was called the hatchet man, who would basically bring people down and basically spread bad news about people and stuff like that. So he's trying to really establish that connection.
Sophisticated candidate. Should tell you. That's.
CREEP was the name of the election committee that was basically helping the committee to reelect the president. It was actually, the acronym was CREEP.
Fired. Somebody said what's the truth? Story is dry. He says we can't seem to think of us as supposed to. Touching. It's media's created. It's not very bright, guys. It's got out of here. Supposedly he's got.
There it is. Follow the money. That's what everything. Follow that money trail to who's spending what on what, who's spending money on to keep people quiet, who's spending money to basically have people do dirty tricks. That's what led to bring down the Nixon administration, was finding out who was buying out who.
I can't tell you that. Right direction. Just.
Okay. So there you go. So everybody, that's pretty much it with the book. So you can toss it out now. Sorry. I hope no, I'm just kidding. But anyway, I hope you bought it cheaply. That's why I'll be able to resell it or whatever. But you're gonna need it. You're gonna need it for the exam. So just keep that in mind. We're gonna review it again. You don't have to toss it out. Don't toss it out yet. I'm just kidding. You're gonna need it for the exam. So Just keep that in mind. All right. And like I said, next week we're gonna talk about extra credit. And the week after that, we're gonna do our review of the midterm exam. Okay. And that'll be also like available to you as a Microsoft Word doc, that review you'll see. All right. Thanks very much, everybody, and I will talk to you